Fantastic. I think I'm going to kick things off. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name's Donald Forrester. I'm a professor at Cardiff University, and I'm just sort of chairing the session. The main event is Dr. Wahida Shah-Kent, who is a lecturer in social work at the University of South Wales. And she's going to be talking as part of our Black Lives Matter series about Black and minority ethnic carers, based on research she did when she was at Cardiff University. Just a couple of practicalities before I hand over to Wahida. What we hope is that lots of people will have questions and things they want to say, but because there's quite a lot of people, everyone at the moment is muted so that we can hear Wahida go through her presentation. But if you have questions to ask, if you could, I think the best thing is if you use the raise hand thing and put up a hand. And then at the end, it'll be my job to go to people and I will unmute you. I'll say your name and unmute you and ask you to share your question or comment or thought. So I'm hopeful that lots of people will have questions or thoughts they want to share at the end of the session. And the way to do it is to press the raise hand thing, and then we'll come to as many people as we can. So having gone over that practicality, I want to hand over to Wahida. The floor is yours, Wahida. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome everyone to this webinar today, which will be focusing on the topic of Black and minority ethnic carers. My name's Wahida and I'll start by quickly introducing myself. I'm a registered social worker and have worked in social care with a focus on equalities for 30 years. Today I'll be presenting my PhD research, which I undertook at Cardiff University, as well as relating this to my practice experience. There's very little research with Black and minority ethnic carers. In fact, no research previous to my study included the voice of the carers of BME children with life-limiting conditions. They had no voice in the academic discourse and were a mystery. It was for this reason that I chose to focus on this group of carers in particular. So this study aimed to bridge this gap by interviewing Black and minority ethnic carers in Wales and in England, and through qualitative in-depth interviews, it was possible to explore their experiences of formal and informal support and support they found beneficial to them and their family. Although the research does focus on parents, carers of children with life-limiting conditions, the findings are relevant across social care for both adults and children's services. Useful insights are provided into the experiences of this group. Now, labels and language are really important. And before going any further, I want to just say that the term BME, which is what I will be using today, is contested, as are most labels attributed to this group. This is mainly because there is an assumption that all who come under the BME banner have a shared experience. However, we know that this is not the case and there is diversity amongst this group. There is also the risk that labels lead to othering of individuals and groups, and this can lead to further exclusion. However, for the purposes of this presentation and for this study, it was the term BME that has been and will be used. Carers is also a term that needs qualifying. We know from research that most family carers, irrespective of ethnicity, often do not recognise themselves as carers. For this presentation, I'll be referring to informal, unpaid carers who are carers of family members. So you may well ask what qualified me to undertake this research on a sensitive topic with a quite vulnerable group. So the last 13 years of practice before my move to academia was spent managing a third sector social care service with BME carers of disabled children and children with life-limiting conditions. When I initially began working for the organisation, they were working with approximately 50 children and their families. We knew there were more BME disabled children and their families out there, but we were struggling to make any connections with them. I was told by professionals in health and social care that these families were invisible, hard to reach, and that they were happy with family support and did not wish to engage with formal services. I was determined to identify this group of carers and to actually check out the hypothesis with them. By the time I left the organisation 13 years later, I was working with and supporting the carers of 400 plus BME disabled children and children with life-limiting conditions. These families consisted of approximately 20 different ethnic groups, speaking 30 different languages and dialects. These carers were caring for children and young people up to the age of 25. These were families mainly based in Cardiff. They had been there all along. They wanted and needed help and support. So it's quite interesting to see how families and these communities and groups can be out there, but can feel or be invisible. And we used a range of strategies and tools and techniques which helped us to improve our engagement from 50 to 400. It was this practice experience that inspired me to undertake my PhD study with the parent carers of BME children with life-limiting conditions. So the background to my PhD research is that there's increased prevalence of life-limiting conditions amongst BME groups. So this came as a surprise to me. It was only when I started doing some work with children's hospices that I looked into the research, and I found Professor Lorna Fraser's research, which shows that there is ethnic variance in terms of prevalence of life-limiting conditions amongst children. Black and minority ethnic groups are possibly, depending on which group they're in, 2 or 3 times more likely to have a child with a life-limiting condition. My work with special schools in Cardiff also revealed that there is an ethnic variance. Speaking to some of the largest special needs schools in Cardiff, I found that their BME population was over 60%. So in a special school, the largest special school in Cardiff that works with children with the most complex support needs, their Black and minority ethnic population was not a minority, it was a majority. It was at least 60%, and they were not the only special school which identified that their BME population was actually a majority ethnic population. So what that shows is that there is an overrepresentation of disability and life-limiting conditions amongst that group, amongst BME groups, therefore a greater burden on that group in society. To go back to the academic discourse, the research sorry, back to repeat myself. The academic discourse in particular contained opinions of practitioners and professionals. However, there was no counter narrative, and that was what was important to me, was to actually check out what the views and the statements and assertions were by academics and practitioners, and check those out with the families themselves. In social work and in healthcare, we work on the principles of social justice, so it made sense to me. So the BME parent carer voice was missing, and this PhD opportunity was great to address that. The research also provided an opportunity to explore the role of religion, culture, and spirituality. Did this form a barrier to accessing formal support? Did religious institutions and cultural institutions provide an additional layer of support for BME families? And what role did religion and religious institutions play in the lives of this group of families? I also explored how professionals perceive the needs of BME families. It was important to find out, how do they find working with BME groups? Is it more challenging? Do they find any barriers in particular that they would like to address? What were some of the issues and how could they be supported? So how can we support practitioners to work better or more confidently with diverse communities? And finally, the aim was to shed light on the lived experience of this group of families, because it is an invisible group, and it is a group that we don't know a great deal about. So you'll be thrilled to hear that I won't be spending a lot of time, on the methodology. However, I will just quickly, However, I will quickly run through a little bit of background. So this was a mixed method study. The qualitative interviews were conducted with two groups of participants. First group was parent carers of Black and minority ethnic children with life-limiting conditions, and this was 20 such participants. And the second group was professionals working with children with life-limiting conditions and their parent carers, and that was a group of, that was 10 people. Participants came from both England and Wales, and professionals came from health, education, and social care. The research question was, who supports the families of Black and minority ethnic children with life-limiting conditions? And the quantitative element involved an analysis of Way 5 of the Millennium Cohort Study. A comparison was made between white and BME children and children with long-standing illnesses and those without. An important finding in relation to the quantitative element was that there is a paucity of data regarding ethnicity in child disability. For the purposes of the presentation today, and due to time constraints, I will only be focusing on qualitative findings. However, if people are interested, they can get in touch with me and I can go through that with them at a future date or make appropriate arrangements. So what is known about carers? What do we already know about carers in general? A review of the literature shows that some aspects of caring for a disabled child, a child with life-limiting conditions, is shared by parent carers, irrespective of ethnicity. So the range of issues experienced by this group of families are complex and wide-ranging, and they include the impact of caring on their physical and mental health and well-being. And so there is a lot of literature on this topic, and it is there's lots of evidence to show that caring for a child or an adult can have a negative impact on the health and well-being of carers. And in my interviews with parents, this was a recurrent theme that came up over and over again. Financial impact was another theme that came through the literature. Disability and poverty have a complex relationship. Families of disabled children can incur considerable additional expenditure on heating, housing, clothing, equipment, and other items. So disability and poverty, I'm going to go over this again, have a complex relationship. Families of disabled children can incur considerable additional expenditure on heating, housing, clothing, equipment, and other items. In the UK, disabled children experience higher levels of poverty and personal and social disadvantage than other children. Providing basic necessities can be costly and place financial pressures on parents. Parents caring for a child with a life-limiting condition have fewer opportunities to work. Despite the availability of disability benefits, the complexity of the system can result in challenges in accessing these benefits. Professor Lorna Fraser found in their research that the highest rates of prevalence of life-limiting conditions were amongst those living in the most deprived areas of England. So there does seem to be a relationship between poverty and disability. Through interviews with parent carers, they recounted efforts they made to remain in employment, but which were in vain. They spoke fondly of their previous work life and identity. They clearly missed the opportunities for socialising, and some of the mothers spoke of loss of financial independence and the impact this had on their self-esteem and their well-being. Social isolation is another theme that came through the literature. People spoke of not being able to take up opportunities, recreational opportunities, and lack of support. Disabled children and their families are known to face a high risk of social exclusion if they do not receive appropriate multi-agency support. Parent carers' health has been shown to improve as a result of support or respite, particularly during periods of high stress. Without support from essential services, parents may feel they have little control over their situation, leading to feelings of loss of control, hopelessness, or despondency. This was a theme that came through over and over again in the literature. Families spoke of their wishes to have a sense of normality for the whole family. This is where respite and hospice services have a crucial role to play. I also mentioned the literature around siblings, and this is important because this group of families, their parents had more than one child, so a recurring theme in the literature was the fact that they were keen to maintain a sense of normalcy. So whilst caring for a child with complex support needs, parents and carers were very keen to ensure the needs of other children in the family were also met. Of course, due to the symbiotic nature of family life, inevitably caring for a child with a disability or life-limiting condition will impact on other family members. My mouse has disappeared. So those were some of the generic beliefs around and themes that emerged from the academic literature around caring, being carers. But what does the academic discourse say, particularly about BME families? Well, the main themes were about BME families not accessing formal support because it's against their cultural beliefs. Religion prohibits them from accessing formal support. They have a greater resource of informal care, family and friends, social networks. This is reinforcing stereotypes of BME families living in extended family households with multi-generations living under one roof and homogenizing their needs and experiences. Many of these beliefs around BME families and their support system were reinforced by the interviews with practitioners that I undertook as part of my PhD research, and I'll speak more about these as we go further. So, what were some of the findings as a result of the interviews? There were three main themes, and one of them was around religion. So an important finding from the carers' interviews was that much of the experience of parent carers of BME children with life-limiting conditions was not very different from that of white families of disabled children or children with life-limiting conditions. Many of the challenges faced by families and their concerns and worries for a child with a life-limiting condition and other family members were common to those mentioned in the literature for majority ethnic families. However, what was different was how professionals and services perceived BME families and their needs as being different, with an element of othering. And as I said earlier, the risks associated with labelling and othering are that we can risk dehumanizing people. We can forget the human element of our interaction with them. So religion was found to not be a barrier, not forbid families from accessing formal support. Participants did not raise any issues regarding unmet religious or cultural needs from those who were accessing formal support did not raise issues regarding unmet religious or cultural needs. In fact, they were very, very grateful for the lengths that organisations went to include religious and cultural needs and dietary needs in particular. Although no parent participant mentioned experiencing racism or prejudice or discrimination, they may have experienced this but either not being aware of it or may have had experiences that they chose not to mention for fear of negative repercussions, such as service withdrawal, or they may have felt uncomfortable talking about it in general, because talking about discrimination and racism isn't easy. It can feel shameful. You can feel that this is something that is your fault. So that was something that religion came through in that context, in that it was not found to be a barrier to use of formal services. Not one family cited religion as forming a barrier to formal support. However, the interviews with professionals highlighted that there was a widely held belief amongst them that BME families were choosing not to access formal support and had no need for this service, and religion was cited as the main reason. The next theme is that came through from the qualitative research was regarding informal support. This was explored through interviews with both parent carers and with professionals. Although carers identified family members as providing support, this tended to be emotional support rather than practical support, and often through social media, not face-to-face. Their family networks were actually dispersed around the world. So when I'd speak to somebody and I'd say, do you have family support? They'd say, oh, yes, I do. My mum, I speak to her at least once a week, or I speak to her a couple of times a week or something like that. And I say, do they live locally? And they say, no, she's in South Africa or in India or a different country. So carers also identified that most family members did not have the time due to their own family responsibilities, nor the skills, because it's complex. There's a lot of complexity involved in caring for somebody with complex support needs. Or did family members have the confidence to help them to care for their disabled or life-limited child? So this resource of informal support appeared to be available, but not for practical reasons. Informal support was an inadequate substitute for the trained staff support that they could access or receive from formal services. Formal support was the next theme. So families expressed the need for formal support to help them with their caring roles. They were desperate for respite, for opportunities to socialise. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a high level of social exclusion for experienced by families of disabled children and children with life-limiting conditions, and hospices and other disability charities are able to help meet that need. They were also keen to access peer support, which is available essentially through formal support services. So often people said that although they were parent carers of a disabled child and had been for many years, they had never met someone else who who shared their experience and their ethnicity up until they had met through groups, peer support groups in formal support, through formal support services. Those families accessing formal support found it helpful, and they formed strong relationships with practitioners. They spoke particularly well of support they received from hospices, and they had some excellent relationships with their consultants who went to great lengths to support families. So going back to religion, although it was found not to be a barrier to use of formal services, these were some quotes that I thought would be useful to help provide context to how religion and spirituality impact on carers, BME carers. So Adnan's father spoke. He said, I do read my Quran quite often. I find it quite comforting. It's actually important in hospitals and hospices to have those sorts of facilities. Ruby's mother no longer attended her temple after someone told her that her daughter was disabled due to some bad act in her past. So she felt stigmatized, and that really was an upsetting experience for her. Religion, according to Rihanna's mem, religion makes allowances for extraordinary situations like those of our children. So even though people may have read that somewhere that certain religions prohibit taking of support, in these particular circumstances, people are, these are exceptional circumstances. Sorry, my computer's beeping away. These were the practitioners' views of how religion impacted. Karen stated that, and Karen was the head of the service, she stated that we found assessments of religious and cultural needs weren't complete anywhere near as often as we'd like. Karen and more than one organisation mentioned the lack of assessments being completed in terms of religious and cultural needs of BME families. Angela spoke that sometimes assumptions are made. So if a family, if a practitioner meets a South Asian family, they make assumptions around what their religion and culture may be, and accordingly they will put down their dietary beliefs, assumptions around those as well. Nadine was very open and honest, and she said, I don't feel confident. There's always the fear that you're going to offend. We avoid tricky questions. And what she meant by tricky questions was any questions around religion, culture, and how ethnicity may impact on a family's needs. Hema stated, staff say, no, we don't want to ask. We're not comfortable with asking people's religion. And it's more about them than the families. So that was a really powerful quote. It's more about them than the families. So religion appears to be a barrier to formal access to formal support services, but this is not the fact that the families are making it a barrier. This is because it seems to be some tension between practitioners and organisations. I can talk much more on this topic if people are interested in exploring it further. So the findings from the professionals demonstrated that certain racial and ethnic stereotypes of BME families still persist in practice. The interviewees came from a range of professional backgrounds. This included hospices, the NHS, social work, and schools. They included BME and white professionals. It's important for me to state that I did not go in looking for examples of racism or discrimination. I just wanted to find out what were the barriers. Why is it that on the one hand we have families who are in desperate need, BME carers in desperate need of formal support services on the one hand, and then we have formal support services very keen to work with that group, and what were the barriers, what were the reasons that the two weren't meeting. So professionals were asked about their perceptions of the needs and experiences of BME families of children with life-limiting conditions. They were also asked to identify barriers to uptake of services and provide insights into the experiences of BME families who had engaged with their service. And two themes emerged from the interviews, which did not feature in the parent interviews, but could be a barrier to accessing formal services. These were racial and ethnic stereotypes of BME families and the stigma and blame directed towards this group of families. So, for example, Mary spoke, one of the participants who worked in an NHS setting. She stated, in terms of BME families, quote, they're a closer community and a closer network. A lot of them have larger families and they will depend on family more. Their faith leader, if they have one, will probably already know about their situation and support them. I do think BME communities are closer. Maria, who worked in an NHS setting and also a hospice setting, said a lot of the BME families have large networks. They're very close to their extended families. Karen, however, challenged some of these beliefs. She referred to several common ethnic and racial stereotypes of BME families. However, she explained, so these were some of them, some of the stereotypes that she shared with me. Quote, families from BME communities want to provide all the support themselves, is something that a professional colleague had said to her. Another colleague had shared this quote, they have so many extended family that their needs are all met. Another practitioner had said, quote, mother would like help, but father won't allow it. However, as I said, Karen was challenging these stereotypes and beliefs, and she stated that, quote, it would be absurd to make that assumption apply to all families. It can't possibly. It's all very anecdotal. It may be true for some families, but there's a tendency for stereotypes to be created and then for people to say, oh, well, there's no point in referring them. The fact that we and other hospices have had families in proves that's absolutely not right. So Karen was listening to the views of her colleagues, but she was also critically analysing and evaluating her practice experience and some of the families who had attended used their service. Interviews with parent carers of BME children with life-limiting conditions demonstrated that BME families had support needs and valued the support offered by formal services, irrespective of whether or not they had family support. Formal support can be a gateway to further services and sources of support, such as peer support, charitable grants for relevant disability equipment, and family holidays. It's not a substitute for informal support, and informal support is not a substitute for formal support. Carers should not really have to choose between the two. So also what came through was that there was an element of stigma and blame sort of levelled at families of BME children, disabled children, and this came from community and from practitioners. An example of this is a participant spoke of how when they have assessments with a different organisation, every time they have a new assessment, they notice that they are asked whether her and her husband are related. Now, she knew exactly what that was implying. It was implying that an element of blame, that you and your husband clearly are related. There may be an element of consanguinity, and therefore that really had a negative impact on the family. And this parent carer said that they would refuse to engage with any service after that, what could be considered to be a microaggression. Stigma and blame also came from community members. And this is something that comes through in the literature, and this is an experience shared by many parent carers of disabled children, irrespective of ethnicity. Professionals spoke openly about their lack of confidence to address and assess religious and cultural needs, and that was again evidenced by some of the audits that were done within organisations to show that there was a lack of collecting of this relevant information. So, sorry. All over the place. Apologies for that. So these are some of the recommendations that I would have for generic practice. It's important that we avoid assumptions and stereotypes based on race and ethnicity, because many of these will be outdated. We need to treat people as individuals and take a person-centered approach. Adopt an intersectional approach. Remember, ethnicity and disability are both important, and there may be other intersectional issues such as gender. Decolonize your research. So in the disability world, they talk about nothing about us without us. So when you're doing research, ensure the inclusion of diverse groups. And if you're unable to, then acknowledge that, because it's important not to produce research and make it applicable to whole populations when it doesn't actually include the voice of whole population. So this is why sometimes, you know, people say, well, I don't know why this solution isn't working with BME groups, because that's not relevant to them. They weren't consulted and included. So there's need for us to decolonize research. We need to decolonize our teaching. So, you know, one of the things that has come up is lack of confidence in practitioners. So training, education is something that we could focus on, instead of looking at how religion impact, how different religions and cultures, what their beliefs are. We should be looking at our own cultures, our own religious beliefs. That's what we should be exploring, because what I found through the research was that those practitioners who had who had strong cultural and religious beliefs themselves were more confident in speaking to families about their religious and cultural needs. So training for staff should focus on their own religious and cultural beliefs. Microaggressions are really important to consider, and unconscious bias. It's important to demonstrate anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice, utilise resources such as culturograms to support assessment. So some of the practitioners spoke about how uncomfortable they felt speaking about this topic, but there are tools and techniques that you can utilise to support you in this process. There are particular recommendations for social work, because in the research with parents, that there were particular issues around lack of contact with social services. So social workers need to adopt a more proactive approach. A multi-agency approach will be beneficial, and presence of a social worker at the time of diagnosis would be particularly helpful for BME families. I'm going to very quickly go through the take-home message. Often people say we've been doing things in a certain way for many years. We're not reaching BME groups, whether that's through research or practice. What can we do? What can we do to improve our engagement? Well, to affect change, we have to embrace change, and change is uncomfortable. So we have to come out of our comfort zone, and we have to be brave. We have to do things differently. Rethink the narrative around BME groups. Avoid racial and ethnic stereotypes. Check them out with individuals. These continue to persist amongst staff in health and social care. Review and redesign services to consider diverse contexts and need. Consult people. As practitioners who work so closely with families, we assume we know. However, I found through my research that even after 13 years of directly working very closely with these families, I actually didn't know as much about them as I did, because as a practitioner, families will not tell you everything. They would not disclose the impact on their mental health and well-being as easily as they did to me as a researcher. They wouldn't as a practitioner. I realise now, I perhaps didn't at the time, that they will have their own worries. Organisation policies and procedures, communicate these to all staff. So I found that there was a disconnect between senior management, who were very clear about their aims and objectives and goals to engage with BME groups. However, the practitioners on the front line were not aware of these. Improve quality of data on race and ethnicity. So when you're working with families, collect data so that you can measure success and you can look at where the gaps are. Training for staff should be very much focused on them rather than a textbook, a recipe book style of this is this religion and this is how they practice and so on. Responsibility for equality and diversity work should be shared and not left to BME staff. The BME staff I interviewed spoke of the challenge of having to do that on top of their main role, the lack of skills and the assumptions that were made about them having the knowledge, the fact that they themselves actually wanted to participate in training of this source, this nature, and the risks associated with delivering this research, this training to your colleagues and having to challenge them and then having to work with them afterwards. And most importantly, ask yourself, if you're not happy with the current situation, what will success look like? And that will help you formulate a plan accordingly. Thank you very much for listening, and any questions, please.
Thank you so much, Wahida. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really, really interesting. We already have a couple of questions, and I'm going to misuse my role as chair to ask one myself. Could I remind people that the way to ask a question is to press the raise hand icon, and then from those who have done so, we will unmute people to allow you to ask your question yourself, if possible. There's already a couple of other questions come in, but I have to admit I don't know what a culturogram is, and I feel I should. So I wondered if you'd be able to let me and perhaps others know.
Yes, it's an excellent visual tool, and it can help us go through questions. It's a series of questions. I think it's about 7 or 9. I can't remember off the top of my head, sorry. And it helps us get a better picture of why did the family come to the UK? How long have they been in the UK? What family support systems, what resources, what social capital do they have? So it's just a little bit easier to use that as a tool, a bit like eco maps. Practitioners may find it easier using a tool rather than asking open questions using a blank sheet. So it's more of a tool that helps them, practitioners, but it's also it covers all the vital elements of information that you will need regarding ethnicity and service use, potential service use.
Brilliant. I'm not sure if it's a technical issue that I'm not seeing any hands go up, or whether people are being a bit shy, but there's a couple of questions that have come in the comments. But weirdly, I can't see the people who have put the questions in the comments on my list of attendees. I'm now seeing some hands go up. So I will, I think I might have to get Rianne in to help me on the technical side of things, because I can't see the people who, I now see some people with hands going up. That's good. But Dan Burrows was asking a question which also applies to one of your recommendations, which was about decolonizing research. He said in a study he recently was involved with, they struggled to recruit people from minority ethnic groups as participants. And he wondered if you had any hints or tips to make participating in research more accessible.
Sure. I think there's no quick fix, okay? And I hate to say this, and people get really angry and annoyed with me because they just want me to give them 3 points and job done. But there is no quick fix. And as I said, even engagement with BME groups, as a practitioner, when I first started working for the organization I worked for, we were working with 50 children. That was the maximum engagement after 12 years of existing prior to my starting. And then it took 13 years to build up to 400 plus. So it's about, I think it's really important as a researcher to say that it's difficult, it's a challenge, particular skills, knowledge and expertise is required. You may not hold that, therefore access that from the appropriate people. Build links, build relationships, ensure that anti-oppressive practice is embodied from before you actually even start putting in a bid for research. So I'm working with some colleagues at USW at the moment, and we're looking at learning disability, and they had a similar experience to Dan, that they were able to interview people with learning disabilities. However, they struggle to engage with BME groups. So what we're looking at now is how do we start doing a piece of separate research and review and redesign redesign the methodology so that it incorporates the inclusion of representatives from groups and from BME groups, service users, practitioners, academics, amongst other things. But the important thing is that we acknowledge that this research has not been, that does not represent the diverse communities that we work with. Sometimes it's best to pass on the experts, pass it on to the experts. They have much more experience and they have shortcuts. They will have links. And I know that after 13 years of working with BME disabled groups, I had social capital. I'd built a relationship of trust. That's why people were willing to to take part in my research. People also knew that I was able to use the language, the appropriate language and dialects, dialect, the appropriate language, be that regarding Black and minority ethnic groups, be that regarding medical terminology. I had to almost sit through tests with them. So people do check you in that way. So it takes a long time. Don't forget, I started working with disabled children and their families in 2001. And it's taken me a long time to get here. I do have that social capital, that relationship of trust, and I have the knowledge of the networks, amongst other things, and that's a full-time job. So that you can do it on top of everything else, alongside everything else, is it's not really going to happen.
Brilliant. Well, I've got a couple of other questions. I'm going to go to Irina in a moment and then Gary, but Hazel Lim made a really good point about Chinese community and families, but I can't see your hand up, Hazel. If you were able to put your hand up, I'd really like it if you were able to ask the question and then maybe have a conversation about it. If not, I will just ask the question you asked. But I'm going to go to Irina first. So I'm allowing you to talk, Irina. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Wahida. Thank you for fantastic presentation. Just one thing, maybe a tricky one. If you had a magic wand, after having gone through the journey, and you're talking about social capital, and that is the group which is not easily engaged, if you were to go through one, give us one thing maybe, once you engaged with a group like this and established relationship, and completed a piece of research, what would be the best thing to do about impact, impact of such a study? And I know you mentioned a few, but with a magic wand in hand, what would be the biggest, if you like, prize for you for the, where you would say this is a completed journey, and the impact was so good that I would recommend everybody to do such and such?
Sure. Funnily enough, I was speaking about this earlier. If people would just stop saying that religion and culture is a barrier, is the reason why Black and minority ethnic groups don't engage with formal services, can we just draw a line under that discourse and just accept that actually, 100% of the families that I spoke to were baffled by that question, and they said religion and culture did not form a barrier. Can we also stop talking about this this greater availability of informal support systems that exist for BME groups? Let's not forget, BME groups in society experience some of the most highest levels of social exclusion and isolation. They experience highest levels of poverty, housing issues, overcrowding, lack of access to employment, overrepresentation of disability. We know through COVID that there's been a disproportionate impact of COVID on that group, and yet to expect that same group to be able to have an additional resource, an extraordinary energy resource to support a very complex group of carers, how realistic is that? How really, what we really should stop saying BME people are okay, carers are okay because they have formal support, informal support, because where is the social justice element of that? Where is the choice? Why aren't we giving them choice? So for me, I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. It's almost like a revelation, because in essence, you can apply this formula not just to this group, but any other groups which are often being labeled, difficult to reach. I'm working on a care home research engagement program just now, and it's that similarity. Let's just look at people for what they are.
Yeah,
and that lack of formal support where it's being replicated by informal carers or family members, and we almost take our responsibility away as formal services because people are managing. But yeah, no, thank you.
And I just
really
like,
good
sorry.
So go on, Wahida.
And just the last point that I would like to say is that can we please move diversity training away from focusing on different religions and cultures and how they impact and what do they mean? Can we actually focus on individuals and help them explore their own religion and culture to feel more confident about talking about how spiritual needs or lack of those impact on them?
Really, really interesting. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Gary to share his question. I think I've unmuted you.
Yeah. Hi both. Hope you're both okay. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's been really interesting, and yeah, certainly feel like I've learned a few things. With regard to the culturegram, was one of my questions. I've not come across them before. Is there like a freely available template, or where would I go to get that? That's my first question.
Right. So, I mean, the easiest thing to do is if you go on Google Scholar or Orca, you can find my PhD, and in the back in the appendix, there's a culturegram there for you. So
Brilliant. So I can log that. Excellent. Thank you.
In the PhD itself, there's and you know, my mind's gone blank, and I feel utterly ashamed. I can't think of the author who actually came up with it. The letter C is going around in my head, but I can't think anymore. So there is a little bit more information in the thesis regarding that. So, and you're not the first person to say that. It's very easy to use tool.
Yeah, I can see that would be yeah, of benefit to my role, certainly, because there's a few things that we already use which look similar to that around case mapping, and it would kind of fit into that bracket, I think, and probably enhance it. So the second question that I have, and I must admit I missed the first 5 or so minutes of this, so you may have mentioned it, but with if English isn't someone's first language, is language and communication, you know, in your experience and possibly from this investigation, also a barrier, and kind of how much, and is the support in your opinion and through your research there, you know, for that language barrier to kind of break it down?
Right, families didn't speak or complain about lack of interpreters being used, but I got a bit of a undercurrent that children are still being used as interpreters in health. However, the main point I'd like to say is that organisations had really strong policies on using interpreters and how professionals, practitioners, frontline workers should and could access those. They allocated budgets for them. They wrote policies about them. However, these had not been effectively communicated to frontline practitioners. So as a result of that, practitioners didn't know whether they were entitled to book an interpreter, where to book an interpreter from, and whether they had the organisation's support there. And there was a particular anecdote that a practitioner shared with me that she was absolutely traumatized by, as was the family, as was I at the end of the interview, where there was a Chinese mother who had a child with life-limiting condition, a baby. The child died, unfortunately, and they were trying to make arrangements for the funeral. And even though a number of professionals were involved with that family, and even though they all knew that that mother didn't speak English, they used a friend, the mother's friend, to do the interpreting, an informal interpreter, even though, you know, training would have, and policy, if they'd had a look at policy, I'm sure a good policy would say that you don't use friends and family. This interpreter was in tears, this informal interpreter, because obviously they're not a professional, so they can't relay the message. The mother was crying, everybody involved was crying. It was just absolutely traumatic for everyone. So, you know, the learning there is that we just need to communicate more about interpreters, how to access them, availability of money, how to use them. Practitioners don't always know how to use an interpreter. So it goes back to the training. language may not be a barrier for the parents because they make their arrangements, but it does appear to be a barrier when it comes to practitioners and organisations.
Okay.
Fascinating, thank you. We just have 5 minutes left and a couple more questions to get through. I'm going to go to Julie Griffiths, and then I'm hoping Ali Bunyan, who asked a very interesting question in the chat, would be willing to put it to you. If not, I'll talk about it. But first, Julie, do you want to share with us your question?
Hi, yeah, it's just going back to what you were discussing there about interpreters. I work with young carers, so sibling carers, as well as obviously siblings in the household who have parents that are ill. Quite often in our experience, our children will miss school sometimes because they have to go to hospital appointments for a number of reasons. One, mum might not be back in time to pick them up from school, but also possibly mum or dad don't speak English, so the children are used as interpreters within the health setting or social services setting, not so much social services, but more the health setting. So, I mean, from our point of view, we try to advise, obviously, the families that it's not appropriate to use children and the practitioners, and then try to put them in touch with the local language line or go through social services to try and get an interpreter to attend as well, because obviously sometimes a child's interpretation of what's being said is not accurate, from the mother's, from passing on parents' information, but also then interpreting it back to the parent. And sometimes children are reluctant to actually fully expose or interpret what's actually been happening at home. So just to let you know that obviously we have that issue with young carers.
Marvellous, thank you for sharing that. And this is something that you know, it's really disappointing to hear that it's still going on, because there's no excuse for it on so many levels. Children should not be used as interpreters. As you say, it can be upsetting for them. They may be put under pressure to explain concepts which they're unfamiliar with. It may be inappropriate for a son to interpret on behalf of his mother relating to gynecological issues, amongst other things. But really, it's about the children's, the child's well-being. This should not be the case. They should not be missing school. They should not be exposed and made so vulnerable. So it really is a children's rights issue. And you're right to work with the parent carers, but also work with the practitioners, because they have responsibility. They have, you know, they should not be using children as interpreters unless it's an emergency. So we always say, when I used to do diversity training, I would say, don't ever use family members as interpreters, because unless it's an emergency. And the other thing is to remember, even if it is an adult family member, how many of us would be happy for our family members to speak on our behalf? Would I want my mother-in-law to speak on my behalf, which is what happens a lot of the time when South Asian women who are first generation who come to the UK go and access health services. So I concur with what you're saying. It should not be normalised. It is unacceptable, and the impact on those children is really dreadful. And it is a issue of, you know, it goes back to the Victoria Climbié situation. How can we allow religion and culture to disadvantage certain groups of children in society? I've never come across any religion or culture that would allow child abuse. And it should be the same in that if this was a white child, would we think it's okay for them to be pulled out of school to support their family member? Would we be doing things differently?
Some really important practice and policy pointers really about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. We've got 1 minute left, and I'm rather foolishly going to allow one more question from Ali Bunyan about service users talking about mental health practitioner issues. Ali, I've unmuted you if you'd like to ask the question yourself, though you put it in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
I don't know how to get the camera on, but I was just thinking about your point that you said people in your research were more open to talking about mental health with you as a researcher than a practitioner. I was wondering if you thought why this might be, or what we could do to help avoid that.
Of course, as a practitioner, I was going in as a Wahid Kent social worker. So they were seeing me as a social worker. They weren't going to tell me that, speak about some of their vulnerabilities in case I removed their children. People don't always have a clear understanding of how systems, health and social care operate. I was stunned by the casual way in which the majority of participants spoke about mental health issues, serious mental health issues, how they casually spoke about nervous breakdowns, having, being on medication for many, many years. There's some powerful quotes. I walked away from some of the interviews feeling very, very worried about the participants and how they would be, but fortunately, they had good support. So yes, the contrast is massive in the amount of information I received about the impact on their mental health and well-being. Whereas when I was a practitioner, and it was part of our assessment, and I'd say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you feeling as a carer? They would always say, fine, I'm fine, as long as my child's fine, and as long as the other children are fine, everything is okay. They'd never, ever mention anything about their mental health. So I think it's important to create an environment where people are comfortable and able to talk about those. So just bear that in mind as a practitioner.
That's absolutely fascinating, and there are more questions that could be asked, but unfortunately we've run over time. I'd like, on behalf of everyone, to give a huge sort of virtual round of applause to Wahida for a really interesting and thought-provoking talk, which I'm sure has implications for how we practice and how we research. So thank you very much, Wahida, and thank you everyone for attending this really, really interesting event.
You're welcome. Thank you. And if anyone wants to contact me after today and has any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. So my email address is on the first slide. So please feel free to contact me.
And we are putting the slides on our YouTube channel, so you can share with other people or go back and look at them, or the bits you want to look at, or look at the whole thing all over again. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.